Moses, who's Professor of Modern History at the University of Sydney in Australia. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the introduction and for the invitation to participate in this really important conference. Now, I'm not going to read out a paper. I don't even have any notes. If you've only got 8 minutes, it's best just to speak directly. Now, this is a panel on comparative perspectives, but I'm actually not giving you a case study like some of my colleagues here on my left. I'm going to speak about the concept of genocide, which came up particularly early in the earlier panels of this conference. It's important because of its symbolic significance and because of its status in international law. And that's, of course, one of the problems. Why is it that journalists and advocates for victims of genocide or mass violence feel the need to have recourse to this term genocide when there are other terms out there like war crimes, atrocity crimes, crimes against humanity? Why is it that genocide is considered more grave? That's a question that's not usually asked. It's often thought of as the crime of crimes, although that has no legal status as such. But the practice of international law and discursive practice in the international and national public spheres, i.e. attention for particular cases, is framed such that genocide is seen as the crime of crimes, which implicitly diminishes, of course, things which we would otherwise think are rather grave and can constitute the same actus reus, i.e. crimes against humanity. So in this book that I'm finishing, which is called The Problems of Genocide, I write a history of how we got to this, I think, lamentable situation in international politics and which entails, of course, the case we're talking about today, in which genocide is seen as the be-all and end-all of the diplomatic and political game. Now, in a way, there's no alternative for advocates and activists. Okay, but how is it that the game is structured like that? Now, academics can afford themselves the luxury of asking themselves those kinds of questions. A related question will be, why is it that genocide is seen as conceptually distinct from civil war? Relatedly, why is it that the perpetrator state will say, we're attacking these people because they're terrorists or there are terrorists among them, but advocates or these victims say, we're being attacked solely because of our identity. It's an identity crime. The perpetrators say it's a security action, not a crime. It's an act of state, and states have a right to defend themselves from secession and from rebellion. Every state has a right to put down its rebellions. That's what the Syrian state says. Okay? And therefore, the people are miscreants. The Bengalis will understand when I say that, when I use that word miscreant. That's the term that West Pakistani authorities used in 1971. But it's the same message. A secessionist movement, a terrorist, miscreant, and the state has a legal right to use, at times, quite excessive violence in putting it down. Now, this is just the way the law is structured and the way that, unfortunately, discourse distinguishes between legitimate state violence in putting down rebellions or secessions and illegitimate attacks on innocent civilians. But of course, we all know that in practice, in armed conflict, whether international or internal armed conflict, violence against civilians takes place. Unfortunately, that's not how these things are framed. How and why we got to that problem is something that needs to be discussed. At the root of it, am I doing okay for time? At the root of it is, I think, and this is something that might interest my colleagues here from UCL, is the way that behind the concept of genocide lurks the archetype of the Holocaust, which is where the gravity comes from. So we really need to have a discussion about the status of Holocaust memory in not only Western culture, but now global culture. Just don't forget, there's a UN-mandated Holocaust Memorial Day, which I think is in January, of the liberation of Auschwitz, right? 27th of January. So just a day after Australia Day. They're not related at all, unless there is a kind of genocide in Australia, which is actually, so it is related. We'll get to that. Now, and I've written about that as well. But the way the archetype distorts our understanding of mass criminality is the following way. In the Holocaust, the perception is, and it's understandable, that Jews, there are other victims, but in this case, mainly Jews were attacked solely on the basis of their identity because there was no Jewish rebellion, uprising, or secessionist movement in Nazi Germany. So it was a crime purely of hatred, an ideological crime, auto-generated in the fantasy minds of the Nazis. Whereas, by contrast, the argument goes, and it's an argument I contest, but this is the common view, that in other cases of violence, mass violence, people are attacked because of what they did, not because of who they are. It's because they launched a rebellion, or some of their numbers launched a rebellion. And so what do states do in counterinsurgency? They drain the swamp or the sea where the fish are swimming. So that means, well, the villages from which the resistance fighters are out in the fields, so out in the forest, but they're supplied by the villages. So we need to put the villages into protected areas, or annihilate the villages, or move everyone off. This is what occurs in counterinsurgency and in colonial warfare all the time. My view, and a lot of work on genocide and colonialism, that's what genocide is. The Holocaust is a particular version of that, but you need to understand it in different ways than is customarily the case. So you need a kind of conceptual and historiographical revolution in order to put the Holocaust in an imperial and colonial frame. A number of us have been doing that, but you meet incredible resistance from those who are invested in the idea that Jews were a particular type of innocent victim, which I don't deny. What I'm saying is that most victims of mass violence are innocent civilians. Yes, there may be quote-unquote resistance fighters, terrorists, what have you, among them. But it's not legitimate for a state to punish an entire people because a handful of them have become politically violent. And that's what's going on in many cases, I think, in the Rohingya case, but we can think of many others in global history, which is why I think it's very important that there's a panel like this on comparative perspective, so we can see the common patterns. Now, there are common patterns in the modalities of the violence, but there are also patterns we should discern about why certain cases of mass violence against civilians are coded as genocide and some aren't. Why is it that Rwanda is seen as an archetypal genocide, but the Biafra War, which killed a lot more people actually, from the late 60s, didn't? Why is the case of 1971 East Pakistan considered genocide by some scholars, but not others? Okay. Why is it that an enforced famine, as you got in the Biafra case, was not considered genocidal at the time, despite intense Biafran advocacy for a genocide recognition? Why is it, and with this I'll just wrap up, that when you look at a conventional genocide studies course at a university, that you have what I call the greatest hits, and I regard this with great suspicion. You start off mainly with the Armenian genocide. If you're somewhat enlightened, you'll start off with the Herero genocide, so a colonial case before the First World War. Then there might be some Stalinist crimes in the 30s, and then there's obviously the Holocaust. And then suddenly you go from 1945 to 1975, like all violence of decolonization is omitted. You have then Cambodia, then skip another 15, 20 years, then you get Yugoslavia, and then maybe Darfur, and maybe they'll have a week on the Rohingya. But it's a completely distorted view of mass violence against civilians in 20th century global history. And it's because of the distorting effect of a particular understanding of the genocide label. I think we need to have a good discussion about how that distortion works and how we understand the patterns of global history over the last 100 years. It's incredulous to me that in a sophisticated university, you do not discuss the cases of Bangladesh, East Pakistan 1971, and a year or two before the Nigerian Civil War. Altogether, many millions of people were killed, but when you look at a typical Western university, genocide studies course, complete absence. Although at the time, those of us who are old enough, I was just in shorts, but some of you would be old enough to recall these cases, there was an intense global discussion about genocide. With that, I'll finish. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we move straight on to Dr. David Simon, who is in the Department of Political Science at Yale University.
Thank you. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me here. It's a real honor to be here, and I'm happy to participate in this important discussion. I come from the genocide studies tradition, but as a political scientist, my focus is on prevention. And so what I'd like to talk about today is a comparison between some of the elements of the genocide against the Tutsi, we must call it, in Rwanda, with the genocide against the Rohingya, but focusing on three elements that I think have specific implications for thinking about prevention. The first is the way in which vulnerability was manufactured, the vulnerability of the targeted groups was manufactured in both cases, and I'll go quickly through that because I have 8 minutes and because we covered a lot of the Rohingya case there this morning. I'd like to talk a little bit more about similarities in the role of propaganda, and then the element that I feel I'm sort of best positioned to talk about is the similarities and differences in the international reaction, the international context, which is, of course, I think where discussions of prevention are usually centered. So let me first talk about historical exclusion very quickly, and how that led to vulnerability of Tutsi in Rwanda and of the Rohingya in Myanmar. In both, communities were favored in colonial times to different degrees and to different respects. Earlier we talked about, we heard about the role of the Rohingya in World War II during Japanese occupation, how there was more favoritism, more support for British rule, and that led to sort of suspicion. At independence, both the Tutsis in Rwanda, Rohingya in Myanmar began to face some backlash. That backlash dovetailed with the development of a myth of alienness, the idea that both groups were from outside of the country and therefore not a sort of legitimate member of the political community. The rhetoric I'll get more into propaganda in a second, but the rhetoric in Rwanda at the time of the genocide was that the Tutsi should be sent back to Ethiopia via the river, which is to say, one, they should be killed and disposed of in the river, and two, that where they came from was this myth of being in Ethiopia. Entirely not true, but it took root in consciousness of Rwandan Hutus, some Rwandan Hutus, the extremists in particular, and therefore much in the same way that this intense debate over, does Rohingya as a category exist, or this denial that Rohingya exists as a category, that same sort of manufactured outsiderness is a key element of what makes the groups vulnerable. In both cases, it was emphasized that it's not just a matter of rhetoric or perception, but actual citizenship laws. And we're all familiar with the Rohingya case. I'll just add that in Rwanda, in successive regimes, and Mahmoud Mamdani's talked about this, spelled this out much better than I can in 10 seconds here, but that the different regime, the two different post-colonial regimes prior to the genocide, took slightly different approaches to the Tutsi but the underlying theme, the underlying element was that in both cases, whether viewed as a race or an ethnicity, Tutsis were legally, as a matter of law, discriminated against. Like I said, I wanted to talk a little bit more about propaganda. Surprisingly, it hasn't come up that much yet. The basic, if there was one overarching message that used in propaganda that left the Tutsi, it was targeted at Tutsis during the genocide or in the few years leading up to it, it was this narrative that Tutsis were foreigners who sought to disrupt democracy and impose, or actually reimpose, monarchy. And that connected to that, civilians are accomplices. So you can see the roots of, or the extension of what I describe as their manufactured vulnerability. Similarly, in Myanmar, we see I think the meta-narrative is that the Rohingya are foreigners and terrorists who seek to disrupt democracy and impose Islam. In both cases, it's pretty clear that there's nowhere close to a universal truth about it, or it's universally untrue, if anything. But in both cases, again, it's a way of saying it's not just individuals, it's not just a few bad apples who are trying to target the state, it's the whole society, and that all civilians can be legitimately looked upon as accomplices or suspects in this case. But what's really interesting about the comparison of propaganda in the two cases is it's not the message, but the medium. In Rwanda, infamously, it was the radio, hate radio, RTLM, and some newspapers, most infamous was called Kangura, Wake Up, which were very effective in spewing hate, because that's how hate is transmitted. Very effective, but in part they were so effective because it was in a landscape where media had just been liberalized. For 30 years, 26 years, going to 1990, the media had been monopolized by the state. And in 1990, when Francois Mitterrand said, democratize or else, liberalize or else, one of the things that was liberalized to much fanfare from the West was the media. Underappreciated at the time, certainly, perhaps unappreciated at the moment of liberalization, was that opened up a lot of space for extremists and unregulated, hateful speech to not just enter discussion. People were already talking that way, I suppose, but propagating those messages, those narratives, to a much broader audience than had ever been envisioned, at least in Rwanda. You can probably see where this is going with respect to Myanmar. In 2012, when there was the spate of violence against the Rohingya, a specific fact escapes me right now, but there was the media, the social media penetration in Rwanda, in Myanmar was small, under 30%, maybe around 10%. Someone probably has the facts at their fingertips and can correct me. By 2017, through handheld devices, through the smartphone, and through the entrance of Facebook and YouTube into the Myanmar market, that figure was 80% and probably higher. And it was effectively unregulated. Facebook says that it was trying to do things, but I think if it was trying, it wasn't trying that hard, and it was fantastically ineffectual in doing so. So I think there's a similarity to be drawn there, but a lot of thinking that also needs to be done about media regulation, and in particular, private media regulation. What role is there for it? What do we have to do to expect private media companies like Facebook to regulate themselves? Okay, I did exactly what I thought I would do, which is take up too much of my time on the first two, but let me briefly describe the international context. In Rwanda, the big story is that the UN retreated. They had peacekeepers, they had troops on the ground, the Security Council called them home. This is the era of the UN Genocide Convention. I'd say that's the regime, was the UNGC regime. We didn't really know, the world didn't really know how it was supposed to work. We just knew it was out there. We thought, and people, I suppose, if you unpack the thought process at the time, people were saying, well, let's not call it genocide because then we might have to send troops. As if to say, the way the convention worked was it was recognized, then you do something, so if you don't recognize it, you won't have to do anything. That proved, and Samantha Power's book and many others sort of showed that that was a mistaken, faulty approach to atrocity prevention. And so in the years that followed, largely because of Rwanda and also Srebrenica, the world, as it were, refashioned the atrocity prevention regime under the guise of under the umbrella of the responsibility to protect, which was meant to affirmatively say and move beyond genocide. It's important. When there's a civilian population under threat of atrocities, there is a mechanism or responsibility to act. It turns out, of course, I think the moral of the story in 30 seconds here is to say that that's no more, that the construction of R2P is no more affirmative than the Genocide Convention. It's still effectively optional, which is to say the global powers, especially the Security Council powers, have to have the will to say this is an atrocity case for which strident means are necessary. I think the other side of the equation is that the government of Myanmar had learned well from past examples, which is to say that they knew that to stay ahead of this R2P curve, they needed to prevent UN organizations, UN agents from gleaning information. So the High Commission for Human Rights, the fact-finding mission, was prevented from doing work in Myanmar. And the resident missions of the UN that were in Myanmar were effectively co-opted for a significant stretch of time based on the democracy and the economic localization sort of objectives. So I'll stop, unfortunately, rather abruptly right there and look forward to questions. Thank you.
Great. And next we have Dr. Phil Clark, who is a reader in Comparative and International Politics at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies. Yes, it's much bigger than the school. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much to Bays, to Mary and to UCL for the kind invitation to be here. I've been asked to give some comparative analysis on several of the issues that we've been talking around the Rohingya today, especially from the Central African context, which is the region where I conduct most of my fieldwork. And specifically to focus on some of the discussions we've had already today around transitional justice, issues of accountability, prosecutions, and reconciliation in particular. I'm not going to say too much about Rwanda, which is also a country I do a lot of work on. I'm going to focus my comments more on perhaps some lessons that we can draw from Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And in that sense, I think that the most useful, hopefully, angle that I can take on today's themes is some of our developing discussions about the role of the International Criminal Court in the Myanmar and Bangladesh situation. I've just published a book called Distant Justice, the Impact of the International Criminal Court on African Politics, in which I'm highly critical of the work that the ICC has done across Africa in the last 15 or 16 years. And I guess it's with that in the background that I'm going to argue that we should be very cautious about expecting too much from the ICC in the Rohingya situation. Already today, I think we've heard several remarks really pressing for the need for ICC investigations and prosecutions in the Myanmar context. I understand entirely where those arguments are coming from, but I think we should be circumspect as well. And I want to try to draw on my research in several African contexts to suggest why we should be cautious. The context in which we're having this discussion, in fact, has just shifted in the last 2 hours. Some of you have probably seen that the ICC prosecutor has now formally issued a request to the pre-trial chamber judges for the authorization to go ahead with investigations into the situation around the Rohingya. So this would have been a more abstract discussion this morning. This is now, I think, live. I think what that means, looking at the evidence in front of us, is we are probably going to see ICC investigations in this situation. I think there are good reasons, in many respects, why these investigations should go ahead. As we heard from Chris Saroti and others this morning, there's no question that the Myanmar judicial system is both unwilling and unable to deal with cases around the Rohingya. And we only have to look at the actions of the Myanmar military courts around these cases in the last 12 months to see plenty of evidence for that. So there is no complementarity impediment to the ICC getting involved, because it's clear that the domestic judiciary in Myanmar is not serious about dealing with these issues. There's also, I don't think, any impediment to the ICC investigating alleged crimes around the Rohingya in terms of the gravity of these crimes. As has already been discussed today, the ICC will have to focus only on crimes around the deportation of the Rohingya across the border from Myanmar to Bangladesh. But as the ICC judges have been adamant every step of the way through this case thus far, deportation itself can carry with it a much wider range of crimes, including potentially issues of genocide. And I share Dirk's concerns entirely about the use of genocide and the way that this perhaps shrouds equally and sometimes arguably potentially even more serious crimes. But deportation, if it can be shown in the Rohingya case, could carry with it evidence that something like genocide has also been committed. And so I don't think there'll be any question about the ICC's ability to uncover grave crimes that are admissible according to the ICC statute. In a bigger picture, I think it, in fact, would boost the legitimacy of the ICC as an institution greatly if it were able to show that it could investigate crimes around the Rohingya in a systematic and persuasive way. The ICC desperately needs cases outside of Africa. This is a court that was supposed to have a global jurisdiction, but as we all know, has focused almost singularly on African situations since it came into force in 2002. Its first non-African situation around the Russia-Georgia conflict, to put it bluntly, is going nowhere. So if the Rohingya case does not get off the ground in any serious way, the ICC will only have, really, in practical terms, an African remit for the next 5 to 10 years. So it would do the ICC a lot of good to be able to launch fully fledged investigations into what's happening with the Rohingya. All of that said, I think we need to be very cautious about what an ICC intervention may mean in this context. I was struck this morning by Chris Saroti's comment that accountability can only be found through international tribunals. And I understand that sentiment, given the palpable failure of the Myanmar courts, but I think we have good reason to be very circumspect, even about what the ICC and other international tribunals can achieve in this particular context. And I think there is a danger of raising expectations about what international criminal law can achieve in a situation like this. And I say that because, especially in places like northern Uganda and eastern Congo, where I've been researching over the last 10 to 12 years, this issue of raising expectations, especially of victim communities, has deeply damaged the legitimacy of the court and has created enormous grievance and resentment, because communities were told that the ICC would do these great things. It would investigate, it would prosecute the actors considered most responsible for the violence, it would help deliver peace and reconciliation and manifold other objectives, and it's done nothing of the sort. So I argue strongly for the need to have very sober and realistic expectations about what the court can do here. And in fact, I would argue that in many respects, the fact-finding mission that Chris has led and that he detailed, I think, so importantly this morning, in many respects may turn out to be the most important international intervention in terms of gathering evidence and building a very strong and persuasive narrative about crimes committed against the Rohingya, rather than the potential threat of international prosecution. So why am I not convinced that the ICC is likely to do a highly effective job in the Rohingya case. I think there are several reasons for this that come out of the experience of various African states. Basically, people should know what they're getting themselves into if they advocate ICC intervention in this particular context. One key consideration here is that the ICC will experience a severe limitation about the fact that it cannot conduct investigations inside Myanmar. And we have a direct parallel in the situation around Darfur, where the Sudanese government also blocked ICC investigators' access to crime sites in Darfur, and all ICC investigations were conducted in refugee camps, amongst exiles, precisely the same kind of investigative methodology that we heard Chris talk about in the context of his fact-finding mission. This morning, the ICC will have to conduct its investigations in a broadly similar way. Now, what we have seen in the Darfur case is that the ICC has struggled, especially the Office of the Prosecutor, has struggled to build a convincing case. And we've seen this in the two Sudanese cases that have collapsed because of the weakness of the evidence. I've argued in a couple of other places that, in fact, the ICC Office of the Prosecutor is breathing a sigh of relief that it doesn't look like the Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir, in fact, will turn up in The Hague, because I think the prosecution's very weak evidence against Bashir would be exposed. And the reason that the evidence against Bashir is so weak is that the ICC has never been able to put its investigators on the ground in Darfur. What we've also seen in places like Uganda and Congo is that ICC investigators tend to lack local expertise about the local terrain. All ICC investigators to date have been non-nationals of the states where they have investigated. And it undoubtedly will be the same in relation to Myanmar and Bangladesh. We've seen a heavy ICC reliance on local intermediaries and using the kind of evidence that Chris and his team have gathered, heavy piggybacking on other types, especially of international investigation. Now, the problem with doing that is that it may be very convincing in terms of a UN Human Rights Council report. It's a totally different kettle of fish to get that evidence to stand up in the courtroom. And this is the kind of thing that has been driving the ICC judges crazy over the last 7 or 8 years, is the ICC prosecutors' tendency to keep bringing second-hand evidence that has been gathered by third parties. Those cases more often than not collapse, and there is a high likelihood that the ICC prosecutor may try to do something similar in the Rohingya case. There is also, and perhaps in many ways this is more important, a palpable realization, given the ICC's 17 years of operation, that it cannot effectively deal with cases that involve sitting members of government. We have seen this time and again. Either the ICC has developed very antagonistic relations with states, such as in Kenya and Sudan, and those governments have totally shut the ICC down. Or we've seen the Office of the Prosecutor develop overly cozy relations with the likes of the governments of Uganda and Congo. What both of those relations lead to is the same thing. The ICC, every time it tries to bring cases against sitting government officials, those cases collapse within days. In effect, I think we have to conclude that this is a court that is only for the prosecution of non-state actors. The court cannot do, it doesn't have the resources, it doesn't have the wherewithal, and it has an over-reliance on state cooperation that means that it cannot do cases of sitting state actors. And in many respects, I would pose a bigger question, which is there a court anywhere in the world that can effectively deal with sitting members of government when it comes to genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity? No one, international or domestic, has a track record in this respect. The final point that I would make in relation to the ICC is I think, and in many respects I was disappointed I had to leave at the end of this morning's session, soon after the Bangladeshi High Commissioner to the UK gave her very important remarks. Because one of the things that I would have liked to impress her as a representative of the Bangladeshi government on is what is Bangladesh's position on potential ICC investigations around the Rohingya, because it has been noted by numerous commentators that Bangladesh, as a signatory to the Rome Statute, has not itself referred Rohingya-related crimes committed on its territory, which it would have the legal scope to do. It is raising, I think, some very important questions about Bangladesh's own position vis-à-vis the ICC. Now, one possible answer is that Bangladesh is holding its fire in the hope that it can bring an International Court of Justice, an ICJ case, against Myanmar, to engage in the kind of macro-political fight that I think the High Commissioner alluded to this morning. But whatever the motivation might be, it does raise some questions around Bangladesh's own desire and ability to cooperate effectively with ICC investigators. And without the cooperation of the Bangladeshi state, we know that Myanmar won't play ball, but without the full cooperation of the Bangladeshi state, again, ICC investigations are unlikely to go too far. I had some remarks about potentially what we have missed out in our discussion by focusing too heavily on the ICC. I think that there are lots of other potential mechanisms, especially at the community level, that are worthy of emphasis. And again, that would draw on Central African experiences, but I've undoubtedly exhausted my time, and so I'd like to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. And now, Professor Mary Fulbrook is going to speak. She's Professor of German History and is in the Centre for Collective Violence, Holocaust and Genocide Studies in the Institute for Advanced Studies here, and also in the Department of German. Thanks, Mary.
Thanks. Well, I get to speak about the genocide, which many Holocaust scholars refuse to allow to be compared with other genocides. Some of you may have been aware of the fact that just within a week or so ago, the USHMM published a statement on its website refusing all analogies and comparisons. This was because of careless comparisons. So Trump's camps on the Mexican border cannot be compared, or you can't use the word even, concentration camps, for fear this is belittling what was going on in Hitler's Germany. You can't talk about Trump or right-wing populism today in terms of Nazism and fascism because this is belittling it, little Hitlers are belittling it, and so on. So the USHMM has issued a very stern statement about not comparing the Holocaust with anything else, let alone genocides. So I start from that position. I was one of the signatories, along with many, many other scholars internationally, who said that you can't do comparisons, you can't do history without making comparisons. Doing comparisons is essential to history. Even if you think you're just doing a single case study, you're using concepts, a conceptual framework, you're posing questions in the light of wider knowledge, other cases, other places, other times. So comparison seems to me absolutely fundamental, and therefore I reject this notion that the Holocaust is not comparable to other genocides. Definitions matter. How do we define genocide? And as you all know, there are some very specific definitions in the 1948 UN Convention, also the Rome Statute, 1998 Rome Statute in terms of the crime of extermination. But sociologists and I think comparative historians have much broader understandings of what is meant by genocide than the ones that are legally applicable. So I just want to raise a few things very quickly, and I didn't look at my watch when I started, Stephanie, so I have no idea whether I've got 8 minutes left. Okay, so let me look at my watch now. What's 8 and 19, 20?
It's about coming up to 25.
Okay, right.
7 minutes.
Right. I think I'll take my watch off. So I just want to talk about a few things which make the Holocaust both seem to be unique and yet to be intensely comparable, and some of these points may be of interest in the Myanmar case. The method of killing is very often held that the Holocaust is unique because of its industrially organised mass murder in the gas chambers of the famous extermination camps, obviously Auschwitz, but also the Reinhardt camps, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, also in Chelmno with the gas vans and elsewhere. This is an argument which is interesting but doesn't hold water, because in fact more victims of the Holocaust were killed outside the dedicated extermination centres than inside. And some of the most inexplicable parts of the Holocaust had to do with the killings on the Eastern Front, the shootings into mass graves, the killings of people, not to mention what I find equally interesting and utterly comparable, the question of the causation of deaths through starvation and disease in overcrowded, confined spaces, whether actual ghettos or other confined spaces at various stages during the war. So the manslaughter, if you like, which can be seen as murder in certain definitions, of people simply through starving to death or dying of otherwise preventable diseases. So I don't think methods really holds water. Victims, we've had a little discussion about that already, the supposed vulnerability of victims rather than they being people who could legitimately be presented as political opponents or terrorists or whatever. Again, one of the arguments about don't compare the Holocaust is something that people want to say about the uniqueness of the Jewish experience. And this was something which caused a lot of controversy when the USHMM, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, was first being planned. There were certain people who said they would not make donations if it was also going to memorialise Roma and Sinti, Gypsies, or other victims of the Holocaust. There are differences among different victim groups. If you were a gay man, for example, or a Jehovah's Witness, you were in principle capable of redemption in the Nazi view. If you renounced your Jehovah's Witness faith, you would be let out of the concentration camp and then shot in the back as you walked away. So redemption had its limits. But one of the arguments is made that the Jewish victims were slated for total extermination and other groups not necessarily so. But even here we can see huge variations in the nature of the victim population. And in the light of what we've just been hearing about propaganda and portrayal of the victims as innocent victims, I find it very interesting that Hitler and his propaganda team devoted a lot of time and energy to trying to portray Jews as intrinsically dangerous to the pure Aryan race, dangerous in all sorts of ways, whether it's as big Jewish capitalists in the West, international capital, whether it's as Bolsheviks in the East, Judeo-Bolshevism in the Soviet Union, or whether it's simply as propagating racial impurity in the supposedly pure Aryan body politic. So they are portrayed as, in a sense, a dangerous opponent rather than an innocent and vulnerable victim. Thirdly, perpetrators. Who were the perpetrators and why? This is immensely complex. The original focus in the immediate post-war period tended to be on Hitler and his henchmen, and it continues in the popular imagination to be very much Hitler, the SS, the Gestapo, the obvious nasties. But I think what's interesting to explore about the Holocaust in comparison now with the current ongoing situation with the Rohingya is the widespread involvement of a very large number of other groups who are not normally brought into the panoply of perpetrator categories, in particular the army, and we've heard a lot about the army this morning, as participants in colluding, assisting in the killings, particularly on the Eastern Front. Sections of industry participating in the exploitation, the extermination through labour of slave labour and forced labour. Members of the professions, including the medical profession, who assisted in eugenics and then in the so-called euthanasia program, murdering hundreds of thousands of people with mental and physical disabilities. Members of the German civil service at all levels, from the ministries in Berlin, the Labour Ministry, Finance, many other ministries, right through to the civilian administrations, particularly in the occupied territories of Eastern Europe, who were involved in ghettoization, in segregation, in humiliation, in exploitation, and treating those populations as not second-class citizens, but as we were hearing this morning, like the Rohingyas, as third-class, not worthy of life at all, ultimately, excluding them from citizenship and the right to live. But the other area, which I find very, very interesting about the Holocaust, and which isn't adequately brought into the popular understanding of it as the genocide, if you like, is the role of local collaborators in different areas. I've been looking recently at Latvia and Lithuania, and what shocked me with one of the accounts I've just been reading of a historian who is also a survivor from Latvia is the incredible brutality with which local Latvians just went in and murdered the local Latvian Jews instantly. They didn't wait for the Nazis even to get there and give them any orders. Very large numbers of Latvian Jews had been murdered by their Latvian compatriots even before the Nazis got in there and started organising it more systematically. So finally, explanations in terms of circumstances and contexts. I think one of the things that we have to really understand when we're doing comparisons, not the careless comparisons of do they have concentration camps or is there a little Hitler somewhere, but it's actually the circumstances in which a mass atrocity can take place. European surveys of the Holocaust highlight the significance of huge variations between different areas of Europe in terms of survival rates of populations targeted for persecution. There are a number of issues which have a role here. The historical relationships between Jewish and non-Jewish populations in different areas. The timing, the stage of the war made a big difference in terms of what was done or what was seen to be not appropriate to do. Micro studies illuminate intense differences in small local regions and even the roles of individuals. So there are some remaining open questions, despite a massive literature on the Holocaust, an enormous literature. But just to mention one or two of the remaining open questions in concluding, motives. Saul Friedlander, one of the greatest historians of the Holocaust, highlights and emphasizes what he calls redemptive anti-Semitism. But against that, you get someone like Guts Ali, who emphasizes material motives, social envy, greed, determination to benefit. Outcomes, do we explain outcomes in terms of things like the strength of pre-war anti-Semitism, the degree of SS control, whether there are weak states? What are the dynamics and social processes on the ground which get people actually to engage in an act of brutality which may be physically sickening even to those who are doing it? We know it was physically sickening. We know many people had to be blind drunk before they would shoot or had to get blind drunk afterwards. And finally, the two other key issues in this area, the responses of victims. Did they, as Hannah Arendt controversially and wrongly said, go like lambs to the slaughter? But what are the conditions for effective resistance among victims? And most crucially of all, what are the responses of bystanders in local populations and worldwide? We are currently, I think, in the role of bystanders to violence in Myanmar and in the Rohingya camps beyond the borders of Myanmar. What are we doing about it? I love being a historian of the past because it's finished, it's all done, I can tell the story. This is ongoing today, even within the current hours, as we've just heard. And our subsequent historians are going to write about today and say, what the hell was the world doing when it knew what was going on, could see what was going on, and hadn't a clue how to intervene effectively in the way that it didn't and should have done in the late 1930s and early 1940s. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. And now for our final speaker, who is Matthew Bowser, a PhD candidate at Northwestern University. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you to my fellow presenters and to Professor Bird for chairing the panel. It is my honor as a lowly graduate student to present in such illustrious company. And I actually won't be presenting on something that is comparative per se, but comparative in the time spectrum. I will be talking about Myanmar, Burma, and I'm actually talking about the historical and colonial context behind the current Rohingya crisis. My dissertation, which I will be briefly outlining here, examines the origins of Burmese Islamophobia and therefore the origins of the racialization of the Rohingya as foreign Bengali invaders that underlies and is used as a justification for the actions of the Myanmar military. So I will essentially be answering, hopefully to some extent, the question that's been asked throughout, which is why the Rohingya, why is this happening, specifically in regards to that. I will begin by reading two quotes from two very different perspectives on the presence of the Indian communities in colonial Burma in the 1930s. The first is from an anonymous letter to the Burmese nationalist magazine Saipan on the 6th of June 1937. Quote, "Since the dawn of history, Indians have been the leaders of the attack against the Burmans on behalf of the white faces. It would be better if they were not here. I do not want to see them in this country." The second quote, quote, "I must admit that Indians have been partners with the Westerners in the exploitation of Burma, but with this fundamental difference that the Westerner went to Burma with his gun, while the Indian went on sufferance as he has always done in every other part of the world." The second quote was actually said by Mahatma Gandhi in a speech at Rwanda. Of course, these statements have opposite political goals. The former is an anonymous op-ed calling for a ban on Indian immigration to Burma. The latter is Gandhi's protest of the Indo-Burma Immigration Agreement of 1941, which did precisely that. However, both statements operate from the same basic premise that the Indian communities in Burma were homogenous and that they were homogenously exploiters. It asserted that along with the British, they were colonizers and had come to serve as British collaborators and to exploit the Burmese economy. The anonymous writer in Saipan blames the Indian people in Burma as a whole for exploiting the country, and Gandhi actually concedes this point, but argues that Indian immigrants exploited Burma only as victims of British corporations themselves. Therefore, despite whether the perspective was sympathetic or hostile, the image of the Indian immigrant to Burma in the 1930s was one of a colonizer. In short, I argue that the right-wing Burmese nationalists in the 1930s used the Indian immigrant population and the idea of Indianness itself, which came to be closely associated with the fear of Islam replacing Buddhism in Burma, as a scapegoat for the serious political and economic issues caused by British and Indian capitalist elites in the 1930s. As a result, Burmese nationalist rhetoric has associated Islam with foreignness and exploitation, thus leading even indigenous Muslims, such as the Rohingya, to be racialized as Indian invaders. A brief background on this, who knows if I will have enough time, but I'll try to get through it. In terms of GDP and industrial development, those kinds of metrics, the imposition of the colonial administration in Burma and its opening of the economy to the Indo-European business interests appeared to be a modernizing marvel in the country. The Burmese economy developed so rapidly and generated such an impressive amount of wealth, mostly from the rice industry between the years of 1900 and 1941, that it was referred to as the Burmese miracle. In fact, the colonial economy was already destined for disaster before independence. Indian investors saw Burma as a part of India, ripe for investment, and as an outlet for Indian employment. This investment, by both Indians and British, grew until Indian businesses controlled most of the land, employed mostly Indian labor, and gradually drove the indigenous Burman into the position of an indebted tenant. However, many, if not most, of the Indian industrial and seasonal workers came to Burma under conditions of extreme poverty and need. British and Indian corporations used exploitative recruitment methods to transport these impoverished individuals from Chittagong, Ganjam, Calcutta, and many other Indian cities along the Bay of Bengal. They covered the cost of transporting them to Burma to work in the fields, mines, factories, refineries, and docks, and in exchange paid them as little as 15 British Indian rupees a month, which is about £1. By flooding the labor market with essentially indentured workers, these companies caused a glut, driving down wages and workers' negotiating power for both Burmese and Indians. So essentially there were two primary responses to this economic and political dominance from the Burmese. The socialist response, which called for the nationalization of land and businesses in Burma by an independent Burmese state, and the ultra-nationalist response, essentially, one that would consider the reclaiming of Burma from Indian invaders. In a lot of complex events that I don't unfortunately have time to state here, though I'd be happy to discuss in the Q&A or afterwards, the British essentially supported the latter group. When the British granted some extent of responsible government to Burma in 1937, they pushed through the separation of Burma from India and supported the claims of Burmese ultra-nationalist separatists who saw Burma's administration as part of India to be fundamental to its exploitation. In 1938, these tensions came to a head when a Burmese Muslim, possibly a Rohingya by the name of Maung Shri P, published a pamphlet called A Molvi and a Yogi, which was a dialogue that argued for the superiority of Islam over Burmese Buddhism. The nationalist press responded with a flurry of rage with The Sun, the organ of the quasi-fascist leader Husa, posted in large bold letters, "Buddhism has been insulted, take immediate steps." From late July until September 1938, countrywide anti-Muslim riots broke out in Burma for the rest of the year, resulting in hundreds of deaths, the injuries of thousands, and property and the damage of millions. In discussing the cause of the riots, British officials publicly called for increased law and order, of course, and considered them to be a act of random violence, but in private, they discussed Husa's motivations for stirring them up. In his private correspondence with the Secretary of State for India, the governor of Burma, Reginald Dorman-Smith, stated, quote, "Husa appears to be impressed and inspired by the arguments of Hitler's Mein Kampf. He stated that the methods laid down for the attainment of National Socialism were excellent and that he would like to follow them. That he has followed the Hitlerian model of advancing to power is well known," unquote. Despite this, or perhaps because of this, the British supported Husa's claim and his ascent to the role of Prime Minister in 1940, after which he jailed his political rivals and passed the restrictive Indo-Burma immigration agreement that I had previously mentioned that restricted Indian immigration. After the war, it was Husa that organized the assassination of Aung San, whose welcoming and generous proposals towards Indian, Muslims, and national minorities were deemed unacceptable to his king. So what does this have to do with the Rohingyas? The Rohingyas, as an indigenous Burmese Muslim group, were caught in the crossfire of Islamophobic anti-Indian Burmese nationalism. Rakhine nationalists came to view them as Bengali Indian immigrants, despite them having resided in Arakan since before British or even Burmese rule there. Rakhine nationalists assaulted the Rohingya along with Indian immigrants in the previously mentioned riots of 1938. They attempted to drive the Rohingyas out during the Japanese invasion of 1942, when over 500,000 Indians fled in a long march to Assam and Manipur. And in the lead up to independence in 1946 and 1947, they called for an independent Rakhine state that sought the ability to perform violent ethnic cleansing on the Rohingya Muslim population. So what I hope to provide with my research is a colonial context for the present-day racialization of the Rohingya as illegal Bengali immigrants, the rhetoric from which we have adopted from this period, as well as the colonial area assumptions of Muslims as foreign colonizers that underlie present hostilities. Thank you.
Matthew wins the prize for perfect timing without any notice. So there's plenty of time for questions. So yeah, let's open it to talk. Yeah.
Matthew.
Yes.
If you could just wait for the microphone, because the acoustics aren't.
You have mentioned about education, and this is mostly but this is basically it's not exactly a religious issue, it's a racial issue. So Rohingyas include Hindus, Buddhists, of course Muslims are the majority. And in 1826, when the Babis occupied Arakan state, it never built a Baba. It never built a Baba. It was occupied by the Baba state. Then the Rohingya Muslims didn't migrate. Other Rohingyas, like the Rakhines, they migrated to Bangladesh. Presently, there are several, quite a big number of Rakhines existing in Bangladesh. So this is one thing. And after Second World War, well, yes, they wanted to get free Arakan state, and it was I'm sure that when the Muslims wanted to get free Arakan state, it was actually the entire population of Arakan, including the Rakhines, who were the majority. The Rohingyas were the majority there. So they all together wanted something. I want to get a free state. So that's a different issue. What do you think about China? So you are separating Muslims from the whole problem. Actually, do you think this?
So Should I answer?
Yeah, no, yes, please.
So in regards to the religion of the group, I mean, it's been an issue I've been struggling with throughout my research because on both sides, actually. So for the general Indian population of Burma, obviously there are both Hindus and Muslims, and within the Rohingya group itself, there are obviously also other religions other than Islam. The issue is that the rhetoric that surrounded the Muslims in the 1930s and the Indian group in the 1930s was all Islamophobic, essentially. It was directed towards the issue of intermarriage between Buddhists and Muslims, which the child of that marriage would become a Muslim. So they were worried that there was going to be the replacement of Buddhists in Burma with Muslims. So the entire Rohingya group, whether or not they were Buddhist or Christian or whatever, were sort of included under this lumped-in category, just as the rest of the Indians were. Now, in regards to the creation of the independent state in 1947, 1948, I'm actually just getting into that myself, so thank you for that. That's certainly something that I'll have to correct. 1942.
There was a fighting between the Arabics and non-Arabics.
Right. Fair enough.
Thank you. Could we
Bystanders at UCL. So I'm very interested in this idea of comparison. One thing that's many unique things about Holland. One thing that strikes me is that the Holocaust was perpetrated by what was the strongest country in the world, 20th century Germany. But the other genocides we've heard about are actually being perpetrated by relatively small countries in terms of economic or military clout. Surrounded by, Rwanda, there's competition predominance between America and France. We've heard about Myanmar, competition between China and India, not quite know what the response is. So I just wondered, what is the space internationally that develops that actually allows these genocides to take place? And I think that's very much echoing the sort of point that Dr. Zani was making in the first sessions.
Thank you. If we could keep answers reasonably short from as many of you can contribute. Well, no, I didn't actually.
Okay.
Sometimes questions get missed, but if you could then be quick, so.
I'll respond very briefly to that one. The person who's written most about this is Professor of History at Southampton, Mark Levine, who's written about genocide in international relations, if you like, and Martin Shaw as well, who used to teach at Sussex. So Mark's thesis is usually drawing on Wallerstein to some extent, is that semi-peripheral states are the ones that are most likely to do it because they're trying to catch up and prevent themselves becoming utterly peripheral states and trying to become core states. So they're under geopolitical pressure. It's often economic, but it's geostrategic as well. And so there are moments of geopolitical security desperation where they're more likely to take desperate action. And Mark actually wrote, speaking about Bangladesh, wrote a very important article a while ago in the journal Third World Quarterly about the Chittagong cracks. So a slightly different case, but in the same region, about the way that the Bangladeshi state was comporting itself to indigenous people, tribal peoples, forest peoples in Chittagong, because it wanted access to those resources, and access to those resources were important for state viability in an economic international system.
And if I could push back on just two things. First, that it's only been small states outside of Germany. Nigeria and Indonesia are two of the, 8 largest states, and they both, well, except that Biafra had certainly mass atrocity elements. They're there. But the other thing, I think, more important thing to push back against is that it's this it's superpower competition that somehow creates the space. I think that overstates what superpower wants and sort of runs the risk of seeking out conspiracies. With respect to Rwanda, and I think to some extent with respect to Myanmar, what kind of afflicted the superpower or the Security Council powers were a combination of ignorance, deception, and cowardice. In truth, they just didn't care enough to get involved, particularly in these small state issues. I suppose there's something emerging there. Nigeria and Indonesia do fall maybe more into that category. But with Rwanda, it was really just scared to get involved. There was no prize in securing Rwanda's trade. It was more a fear of an emerging international order that would require commitments of resources.
Anybody else want to comment? No, yeah, please.
My name is Claudia. I work at a charity called the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, and good knowledge is on the 27th of January. Thank you for the very interesting contributions. One thing that I think sticks out as a particular hallmark of the Holocaust and certainly some of the subsequent genocides is, and I think you touched on this when speaking about the murder of Lithuanian and Latvian Jews by their neighbours, is the degree of assimilation and integration of the persecuted community prior to the commencement of the genocide. I wondered if any of you could speak a bit more about the extent to which there may or may not exist in Myanmar, and where there are policies sponsored by the government to specifically prevent that, such as kind of regulations on intermarriage, but to the extent that it does exist.
I think it's a bit more complex than that. I take your point about the degree of assimilation and integration, but actually there's a huge distinction if you look at the different waves of persecution of Jews across Europe. The most assimilated and integrated were the German Jews. There are many, many cases of people who are Christians, whose grandparents had converted, who just then discovered in 1933 there was a slight problem with grandparental, there's some quite witty jokes they make about it at first, but accidents of birth. And in explaining the capacity of Germans to kill, it's quite interesting that many of them always know German Jewish friends and neighbours and so on, and then when they go east and they see the Ostjuden in ghettos who've already been starved and humiliated and walking around in rags, they start writing letters home saying, actually the propaganda in Zeshturm was true, I didn't realise it, but these Eastern Jews are really a race apart, so they see other, and that makes them able to harden their hearts against them. Whereas I think the explanation then of the Latvian Jews killing, the Latvians killing Latvian Jews, or the Lithuanians killing fellow Lithuanian Jews, is a different one entirely. So I think it's much more complex when we start looking at it on a micro scale. But anyway, I believe I'll pass over to the others for the comparisons there.
Yeah. I'd like to pick up on that, the Lithuanian Latvian case, the Baltic case, and maybe draw an analogy to the Myanmar one, which I'm not an expert on. And it's about the issue of perception of collaboration with outside powers.
Yeah.
Now, in the Latvian or the Baltic case, what's often forgotten is that this violence in which ultra-nationalists, not just everyday Latvians, but ultra-nationalist extremists took advantage of a power vacuum to murder Baltic Jews, occurred when the Soviets' occupation army, which had invaded their countries, and during which there was a perception that Jews had welcomed the Soviets. When they were leaving, as the Nazis were coming, there was a couple of weeks or months or so. It was in that moment that this violence took place. So that was a highly contextual situation. It didn't just happen out of the blue. It was an accusation, clearly illegitimate in many ways, that an entire community was guilty because several members of the community had welcomed a brutal Soviet occupation which had commenced mass deportations and incarcerated and murdered lots of people. It was it was experienced as a terroristic occupation. And so there was a bloodlust revenge. That's what the motivation was, ethnically coloured, obviously, in that moment. Now, that's very different from other circumstances throughout the Holocaust, although generally the perception that Jews were in Eastern Europe were welcoming of Soviet presence was the common denominator, I think Mary would agree, and was highly damning, and was of course highly illegitimate as well. But the idea that a community is collectively guilty because they've engaged in political betrayal in the past and in the present, and possibly in the future. There's always a preemptive dimension in genocide. That's the key commonality, I think, that links cases over a century or so. And that's why colonial and imperial circumstances are so common in genocide, is because you have a situation where an outside power inserts itself into a complex multinational or ethnic community and collaborates or seeks to collaborate with the elites of usually a minority to do its bidding in governing these places. And then when they leave, then you get revenge.
And I'll add one quick thing about assimilation. I sort of emphasize the political outsiderness when I was talking about vulnerability, not innocence, by the way. What made them vulnerable was the perception that they weren't innocent. So sorry about that confusion. But it's, in addition, layered on top of that political outsider status is a concerted effort by extremists, sort of in the long run, to prevent assimilation. So in 1990, in this new press, there was something published called the Future Manifesto, which was 10 commandments. That's the 10 commandments are different, but it's a bunch of commandments. The first 6 of which were about not intermarrying, not working with, not trying to separate Hutu and Tutsi. And I forget the exact date, but I know that there have been similar sort of documents and propaganda in Myanmar trying to say that if intermarriage and intermingling between Muslims and Buddhists is a crime against the state, essentially. It's a social version. It's an effort to prevent assimilation. Exposed.
Thank you. Yeah, that's okay. Right, we have a question. Oh, yes, and then I'll come to you. Yeah, if you could wait for the microphone.
So I have kind of like a point and then a question, and I think you kind of already alluded to this. When you look at the Holocaust, every other genocide that comes thereafter is always compared to it. Unfortunately, that's the very nature of it. And so therefore the crimes seem, I think the Holocaust seems the ultimate, and everything else is, or it's almost like that, or whatever it may be. Therefore, what do we do with the definition of genocide? Because obviously it's not all-encompassing enough. And then secondly, you were talking very much about the ICC. So if not the ICC, yes, we have ICJ, and you said there's many other elements that can be used. If you could kind of go into a bit of detail of that, I mean, obviously you have that limited time within 10 minutes, so maybe this might give you an option to go for it. So, thank you.
I mean, on the first question around the definition of genocide, I mean, this is one of the big discussions, I think, in the scholarship at the moment is, there are 2 possible steps. I mean, one is either to say the definition of genocide as it exists in the convention at the moment is not fit for purpose because of its selectivity about which groups constitute the victim targets. This needs to be greatly expanded to capture the kinds of cases that we see in the 21st century. The other potential argument is to say leave the definition as it is, but in many ways go back to the sorts of things that Dirk was talking about at the start, and beef up the significance of non-genocide categories of atrocity to say that these are different, but they are by no means less grave in this respect and warrant international attention just as much as the notion of genocide does. So that's really where the kind of 2 choices lie, I think, at the moment. In terms of potential avenues beyond the ICC, I mean, in many ways, the comments I would have made in my presentation, which I'll now respond to much more briefly than I would have otherwise. I mean, I really think there are possibly 2 issues that I think are getting swamped by the kind of ICC obsession. And again, this comes more out of my research in Central Africa, I mean, rather than a kind of deep knowledge of the Rohingya this. Clearly, I think the first one, if we look at cases in Central Africa that also involve mass displacement of the population and comparable to what we've seen in the Rohingya, it's often missed out that there are some really key issues around citizenship and reconciliation first. So issues, first and foremost, dealing with this problem of the statelessness of the Rohingya population. I mean, it's not clear to me, as someone who doesn't work specifically on the Myanmar case, and I'm not sure I'm getting heard enough today to get an answer to this. Now, what precisely is the regional and the international thinking on what happens to the Rohingya? I mean, is it about carving out an almost semi-permanent refugee status in this part of Bangladesh? If that is what we see, then it is comparable to the sorts of things that we've seen, for example, in Eastern Congo, in Northern Uganda, and in other parts of Central Africa in the last 20 years. And that has produced massive problems. I mean, many of the African states that I work on have not dealt with this statelessness issue vis-a-vis refugee and even IDP population. And the danger is you then end up with this sort of semi-permanent refugee status, which tends to breed an enormous amount of resentment and grievance in those camps, with the danger of future violence emanating then from refugee populations, which, for example, is the kind of thing we have seen in Eastern Congo over the last 20 or 25 years. So I think there's a huge amount of work to be done there around how to resolve the statelessness question. If the idea is that eventually the Rohingya may go back to Myanmar if conditions alter massively from what we see at the moment, then there has to be, I think, a much bigger emphasis on things like community-level reconciliation, what that is going to mean, preparing Rohingya, but also preparing recipient communities for the eventual return. So, that's a set of issues that I think we need to talk about. The other issue that I think perhaps an over-obsession with international criminal law misses out is the potential for displaced populations themselves to be very important agents of transitional justice. And there's a huge amount of work being done on this in Central Africa and in other parts of the world. The idea that displaced populations shouldn't only be seen as victims, they should also be seen as important agents of accountability, reconciliation, and other objectives. And that can take numerous forms. It can take the form of displaced populations gathering their own evidence and information and building their own historical narratives of the most recent violence that they have suffered, as well as arguably some of the historical resonances that Matthew's been talking about. There is also, I think, an important debate happening in places like Northern Uganda and Eastern Congo at the moment around displaced populations advocating for reparations and debates about who exactly is responsible for paying reparations. That's a tricky one, clearly in this context, because of the intransigence of the Myanmar government. But there's also a colonial dimension here. Is there scope for local Rohingya communities, now based in Bangladesh, being mobilized to start to think about issues of colonial reparations? There's some very important advocacy work that I think can be done there beyond the ICC dimension. And then the other one, I guess, is the role often of displaced populations in mutual support activities, whether that's economic, whether that's artistic. Very important issues there around things like trauma, healing, social cohesion. Again, well documented in numerous parts of Africa and across the world that focus especially on the needs of displaced populations and the idea that displaced actors should be seen as agents of their own momentum rather than necessarily waiting for the rescue of some international body, which, as I've suggested, may be a bit of a fool's errand given what we know about the ICC today.
Is that okay? We had a.
Thank you very much. It was really great to hear it from you. So my question is, can we call Rwanda genocide and Rohingya crisis as intentional man-made disaster? If so, so far I've understood that these were preventable. If these were preventable, then don't you think it's time to have UN responsible for it because it is their failure? For example, it's like 50 years, 60 years, 70 years, the same thing is still going on. Thank you.
I'm perfectly happy with the phrase that you just used of intentional man-made disasters. They clearly have human fingerprints all over them. I'm a little less comfortable with just saying it's the UN's fault. It is, but it's the UN's fault because the UN is controlled by sovereign states. It is Rwanda in particular is the United States' fault, France's fault, Belgium's fault, and the Rwandans who committed the genocide. but in the international context, it was those Security Council members, plus Belgium, who pulled a force that was there, that was capable of abating the violence of the genocide significantly, pulled them out. It wasn't the UN. The UN was there. The UN in the forms of peacekeepers. The Security Council pulled them out. In Myanmar, we had the UN, the Human Rights Commission, had created a fact-finding mission, had mobilized, the sort of global humanitarian international, to use a word that Alex Wall uses derisively, but they were there. They were ready to do their thing, to raise the alarm. They did. I mean, we heard from Chris earlier, but they weren't able to get into the country. Britain and the US, to some extent, tried to sort of use their leverage past Security Council resolutions that would compel the government of Myanmar to allow the fact-finding mission in, but Russia and China stopped it. So again, these are sovereign states that are using their position within the UN to create a failure. So I think we have to be careful about saying the UN failed because it gives cover for those who are ultimately responsible.
Thank you. We only have about 2 minutes left, so it has to be a really quick question and a really quick answer.
Oscar, I didn't ask it actually, but I have to say it saddens me because I'm one of the very few people to attend Dr. Harris's funeral downtown Hudson. As a friend of the family, I'm somebody who spent nights in a tent outside British Parliament to support their cause. So it's disappointing to see how this whole thing has turned out to be a massive nightmare. I think Professor Kamal actually raised an idea of caution, which is that not to just talk about reducing it's very important. But they have protests and things as well amongst the community. Although, unfortunately, in the case of, I hate to say this, but India is producing a massive amount of fake news on this issue. And in fact, India is a very important source of misinformation. But I think Indian fundamentals. So that's the source. Academics become more aware of fake news, and if you like, the industrialization of fake news from India, or not just from India, but Muslim and other religions. That's one point. The other point is that it's not just Rohingya people. We're talking about other minorities who are also victims of the Burma persecution. And it's a very large minority. We're talking about perhaps 55% of Burma's landmass, which is disturbed because the Burmans do not regard many of these communities, or many of these ethnic groups, as being legitimate Burmese entities. And incidentally, the word Burma itself is a British invention. So the colonialism, the very name of the state was named after a tribal community whose origin, by the way, just to inform everyone here, is in China. Believe it or not, these people are themselves refugees from the Han invasion of their territories, which are now in China. So these people are themselves like groups. So it's a double irony. And they adopted Buddhism, a Buddhism that came from Bengali missionaries. Bengali Buddhist missionaries who converted the monks, for example, and then monks went on to convert the Chinese population who were the monks. And it's a tragic story. Tragic story.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just like to briefly comment on that, which is that I agree entirely in regards to all of the other ethnic minorities, the Karens, the Mons, etc. I mean, these people have all also been fighting against, I agree with Lamar, sort of repression. And what I would say about that is, once again, it's something that we could lay solely or almost entirely at the feet of the British, again, right? I definitely wanted to bring the British into this conversation. It wasn't enough that they caused partition, and they also caused many of the issues that we're talking about today, or at least the origins of such. And then, obviously, there's been a lot.
Don't say too loud. Go back to empire again. It's kind of
Do
empire.
you want to finish? Did you have more to say?
I think that might have been. Oh, briefly also, I apologize about my earlier. Yes, in 1942, the Rakhines and the Rohingya were both tried to be pushed out of the country by the BIA. I actually hadn't heard the question, but yes. So there are many other ethnic groups involved in this persecution than just the Rohingya as well.
Thank you very much to the panelists. I think now I'm right in saying that there is a drinks reception downstairs in the Institute of Advanced Study room 11, is where lunch is held. I don't know if anyone can nod to confirm that. Yes, definitely. Okay, so if we could all move downstairs and see you there.
Not you. He doesn't ask questions. He wants to be up here. But you know, with a conference like this, the trauma is beneath concern. They're very indulgent. I would. What's your question?